right, I'll call the meeting, the extra meeting of New York State Cemetery Board meeting to order. We have just a few items to discuss. I'll start out just by, and we will not have our regular order, right? Just the two items for discussion. So I'll start out by introducing myself. I'm Mark Patterson. I represent Robert Rodriguez, Secretary of State, and Chair of the Board.
Thomas Fuller, representing Dr. James McDonald for the Department of Health.
And I'm Jill Faber, representing Attorney General Letitia James.
Great, thank you. So, is there a setup, Rob, that we need to have, or?
Yeah, why don't you just dive right in?
I don't mean to take you by surprise. Sorry, we should.
No. Louis already told me that I was doing this.
Okay.
We're having this special meeting today because the Cemetery Board has received two very similar notices, both of which are from towns seeking to be lead agency for the purposes of the State Environmental Quality Review Act seeker, and asking for the Cemetery Board's position on their request to serve as lead agency. The Cemetery Board should review the associated materials. Both municipalities have included part one of an environmental assessment form and associated materials, and the Cemetery Board should decide whether or not it is fine with the municipalities being lead agency or instead would want to be lead agency. And also, as the Seeker Handbook tells us, provide any observations or concerns about the proposed actions based upon what we know right now. In furtherance of that, the division and I worked together, we reviewed the materials, and we have drafted proposed resolutions for the Cemetery Board to consider. In addition to the associated materials, we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay.
As I am wont to do, I am very happy to read the proposed resolutions in full while everyone listens. Before we get to that point, you want to start with, I believe the agenda is to start with Pine Lawn?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So Pine Lawn, as the town of Babylon told us on February 28th, and our response 27th, and our response is due tomorrow, Bristol Suffolk LLC is proposing to subdivide approximately 111,000 acres into two lots. This is land owned by Pine Lawn. In April of last year, the Cemetery Board looked at Pine Lawn's application to lease the land and to construct buildings on there as part of a major renovation. Issued a resolution in regards to that I could read that resolution if we want, or I'll just refer to it. And since then, we've shared materials that we received with the town of Babylon, and now the town of Babylon has received part one of the environmental assessment form from the developer and is proposing to act as lead agency.
So one question is the question of lead agency.
Mm-hmm.
Is there another question about issues of concern or areas that we want to point out or discuss at the board level? Is there something that the division or that you were presenting? We can do them separately.
So the proposed resolution for the Cemetery Board to consider lines out a few observations and concerns that the division and I caught in reviewing the materials and based upon our experience of what the cemetery has proposed thus far.
Okay.
And just procedurally, let me jump back and just say, if the municipalities are lead agency, their next step after being lead agency is to make a determination of significance on the actions. A negative declaration ends the seeker process. That's where they've decided that there's no potential for substantial environmental impact. Seeker review is done. A positive declaration, there is the possibility for substantial environmental impact, means the seeker procedure continues. And likely the next step after that is scoping an environmental impact statement. And I just learned that folks who do this more often tend to consider the scoping to be sort of the table of contents for the environmental impact statement. So if after this, the municipalities are lead agency, and if they were to make a positive declaration, then the next step would be scoping, in which case the cemetery board would have an opportunity once again to provide comments and suggestions on the scope of any environmental impact statement.
Okay.
All right. If you would like, I can go through the observations, the
Yeah.
proposed observations and concerns. So, all right. So the town of Babylon in their materials also included a draft proposed municipal code that would be specific to the proposed new zoning area for the technology park. And in reviewing that, a couple of suggestions. One, because the cemetery will continue to own the land, it should allow funeral directors to lease that land. And so we're proposing to the town, you may wish to consider amending your zoning code to prohibit funeral directors from operating, funeral homes on the leased land. Two, we noticed that the proposed zoning district would permit underground parking, and we weren't familiar with the possibility of underground parking in the prior materials we received from the cemetery. We just did want to point out that underground parking may negatively impact the ability to use that for cemetery purposes in the future, as cemeteries cannot use construction debris in burials.
So, and just to point out that part of this is to lease, which at some point could be returned to the cemetery for, theoretically, for cemetery purposes, which is why you're making that.
Yes.
That's
Yes,
actually
thank
the
you.
plan, as was presented back last April, is that the property would all be returned to the cemetery at the end of the lease, but that certain of the buildings they would retain certain of the buildings, essentially used as mausoleum or garage space. As appropriate. I think mausoleum space was the main plan.
We're not reviewing that.
We're not reviewing any of this.
That's right.
now.
No, just
by way of
saying for
background.
clarification.
Right. Further potential concerns and observations. Part one of the EIF expresses the construction of retention ponds, stormwater management practices, and of course, my non-engineering understanding is that the purpose of such facilities is to prevent the negative impacts of stormwater. However, in looking over the proposal, it appeared to us that one of them appears to be in the eastern section, which is closer to Lot 2, which will be the existing cemetery nearby. And, the proposed resolution just expresses the cemetery board's desire to ensure that stormwater runoff and any stormwater management structures don't negatively impact the existing grounds and monuments of the adjacent cemetery. In addition,
There you go.
okay.
If you miss it, I'll say it.
The proposed zoning district permits heights of up to 50 feet. The cemetery in prior materials provided graphic displays of a picture, the cemetery with trees, and then like sort of a computer outline of what the building would look like. I could not find in those materials the actual specified height, so I cannot say off the top of my head whether or not the proposed zoning of up to 50 feet and the proposal of 46 feet is commensurate with what our prior understanding was of, from the existing cemetery areas. You won't be able to see this because of trees. So there's the potential that there may be visual impacts on existing cemetery operations. Okay. The siting may negatively impact adjacent cemetery operations in the Lot 2 through noise and visual impacts. The prior discussions had been a vegetative buffer. The draft municipal code sets forth yard depth setbacks with as little as 65 feet, but with greater depths for residential uses. It wasn't clear to me in reading it whether or not the cemetery would be considered a residential use, or whether or not the setbacks of as little as 65 feet would be less than prior understandings of the proposal, which indicated that the distance between existing cemetery and Lot 2 and the leased land would be at least 100 feet. The part one of the EAF also mentions that between residential areas and the technology park, the possibility of noise walls to abate noise, And I didn't see any specific mention of that in relation to the Lot 2 cemetery. But again, there's the potential for impacts on existing cemetery operations for that adjacent Lot 2 in relation to noise and visual impacts. And then finally, part 1 of the EAF, and as far as traffic concerns, the developer wrote TBD. They're working on a traffic study. So we currently don't have specific information about any impacts on traffic. And so also generation and treatment, storage, and disposal of hazardous waste. The municipality has proposed additional zoning language to put requirements for any handling of hazardous waste as a leased activity. My understanding is that the developer has said in constructing it, no one's going to be using hazardous waste, and the municipality is proposing some additional code language related to restricting any leasees from storing hazardous waste unless the town signs off on it. They do various activities. And so the final part of the resolution is that the cemetery board just simply does not have enough information in relation to the traffic, hazardous waste, and may have further concerns and observations in the future. I will just say that, while we put a proposed resolution before the board, Louis and I worked on it. I got a Word document open. If the cemetery board has anything else it would like to add or any other concerns, we can certainly work on that or discuss it.
So regardless of the, we are not at this point ruling on any of those issues. We're simply identifying those issues as issues that may be of concern, of which we may have an opportunity to either comment on or take action on later.
Yes.
So whether the traffic study is sufficient or isn't sufficient, we think, traffic might be an issue that we would consider as an example. Right?
Absolutely right.
So all we're doing is trying to look and say we're suggesting, I think, that yes, the town of Babylon be the lead agency, and here are some of the areas that we think that they could consider looking at as possible impacts on cemetery operations.
That's exactly
And they
right.
may determine that or not. We would comment on whether they did or they didn't, right? And if they go further in scope, we have an opportunity to comment on the particulars of the plan.
Yes.
I think Rob mentioned this, but one of the things that we were called upon to do in the materials, and I think the secret process, is that we're supposed to set out what our jurisdiction is. So I think, we referred to, in our original, your original resolution back in April, it discussed the leasing statute. The current one also is basically saying, hey, these are the kinds of things that are specifically mentioned in our leasing statute and our major alterations regulation. And I guess relatedly, we're at the level of flagging issues as of potentially within that jurisdiction, potentially things we would be concerned about.
All right. Can people hear Louis?
Yeah, sorry, I've got a little bit of a cold. I'm trying to stay masked.
Yeah, but you still have
Jill,
to
if
hear
you
you.
didn't get that, I can.
Yes.
Okay, people can hear you. Okay. All right. So I guess I'm just.
I'm
trying to
sorry,
make
I was
sure that we
muted. I'm sorry, I have a question. So
Yeah.
if I'm understanding correctly, by identifying the concerns and issues and things that you just flagged, Rob, if the municipality is the lead agency and we identify at some point in the future that studies or data or information received is not consistent with what we believe is required by the leasing statute, would there be an opportunity then to impose any requirements on the organization?
Yeah, so I guess at the conclusion of the seeker process, either through a negative declaration or a positive declaration, we, the cemetery board, are still in a position to make a determination on the application within our jurisdiction.
Okay.
If I'm understanding the hypothetical correctly, if we get to a point where this the proposed action just simply does not comply with 1506-E of the not-for-profit corporation law, yes, the cemetery board can say, no, you don't comply with not-for-profit corporation law 1506-E. We're not approving this.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a little
Okay.
different than saying we can impose it on the seeker review and lead agency, but we have our own authorities.
Correct.
Okay, but I guess just to be more clear, let's just say, for
Mhm.
example, that there's a traffic study. Like, we don't have the traffic study now, so it's not
Mhm.
clear what the impacts would be. Down the road, if we see the impacts are, we have a problem with the impacts. How do we pull that back? Do we have an opportunity to address that, to require the cemetery to address it at that time?
So my understanding is that after scoping, then there is a draft environmental impact statement in
Mhm.
which the cemetery board will have an opportunity to review. There is then
Okay.
a finalized environmental impact statement, and then each involved agency gets to make their findings statement.
Okay,
And this is all before our review under 1506E and.
okay, so no, that makes sense. So as an involved agency, we do get the opportunity along the way to comment.
Multiple
Yes.
Okay.
opportunities.
That answers my question. Thank you.
And then
Oh, good.
still have our own independent authority.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so again, I don't want to be unfair and say it's not substantive, it's procedural that we're dealing with largely here, because I think substance is a certain part of it, but, so in part of that process for us to consider that, I want to be able to just ask the board, maybe after, I don't know if it should be after you read the resolution or not, but if they have any comments on other areas that they might identify, they've read the material, we've read the materials, any other comments on it. I also want to make sure there's an opportunity for public input on each of these, so I don't know when the right time for that might be. Is there any?
Why don't you guys see what you think first? Rob, the one thing I would suggest is don't bother reading the resolution. It's simply too long. Everybody's got a copy of it.
I'll defer to the board.
We don't transcribe these things anyway. We're just in the recorded minutes. We're just going to refer to the resolution that's posted, unless we have evidence.
Well, it's a public action. Not everybody has a copy of it, so.
Okay.
But let me just stop here and just say, does the board have any other questions or concerns, areas that the division and council have identified as potential areas for concern? I have none. Sounds
I mean, the one thing I would just add is, and I think maybe just to make this a little more explicit, is that one of the provisions, the last thing in the resolution points out that, as we said back last April, the project can and in all likelihood will change as the seeker review process and the local approval process moves forward. And there are things that could come up that we might flag them that we can't flag now because they don't exist yet.
Are you amending the resolution that you?
No, it's already, that's already taken into account in the resolution. I was just highlighting that last line.
So might this be an appropriate time to ask if the public has any, is there any of the public? And I don't know if there are people who are representing the cemetery, so let me take just open questions. Is there anybody online that would like to address this question before the board? Okay, is there anyone else that would like to address these questions? Or anybody representing the cemetery or?
Yes,
Okay.
David Fleming representing Pine Lawn from the Featherston firm. Thanks to the board for the diligent work in this step in the process, and as council has pointed out, it is going to be a long and detailed process for engagement with the cemetery board. I wanted to make one particular point based on the resolution that's before the board, and just for clarification for the board as we move forward. The municipality has proposed a zoning code change, which is not directly reflective of the project that's been brought before the board. It provides parameters in which the property could be developed. And while there are specific parameters that the board will be finally reviewing when the application and the seeker process is complete, they may be different than the allowances in the code. And I point that out because I'm concerned that in our review, I'm not concerned, I just want folks to be aware that we don't want to limit the cemetery's ability for future development by also limiting or how the project is going to be outlined. So the project that's going to be before the board in total, when this process is completed, may be smaller or have different impacts, be they height or depth of setbacks from property lines. And I would point out, as you saw in the application, as an example, Pine Lawn has a 50-foot setback generally on most of its borders within the cemetery. So a more restrictive buffer for the cemetery after this project is, the 100 years of the lease is up, or the 99 years, could be a concern down the road. So I just want you to be aware of that. We're looking at really two different things: a code change that the town's proposing, and also a project change. So just we could keep that in mind as we move forward. And I thank you for the detailed review and responding quickly to the municipality.
All right, anybody else wish to speak to the board on the matter before us? Okay, so this would be sort of a more formal redo. If you read the resolution, that would be helpful, and then we'll entertain any additional questions, and then we can take a vote or amend the resolution as presented.
Okay. Whereas Bristol Suffolk LLC proposes to subdivide approximately 111 acres of land owned by Pine Lawn Memorial Park and Arboretum, the cemetery, create a new zoning designation called Planned Industrial Park 2 on approximately 100 acres, and constructed an industrial technology park consisting of 9 buildings and totaling 1,617,471 square feet, the proposal. And whereas the cemetery board has received a letter dated February 27, 2024, and associated materials from the town of Babylon, the town, in which the town seeks lead agency status and the cemetery board's comments on the proposal. And whereas the town included part 1 of an environmental assessment form and draft municipal zoning code language concerning the proposal. And whereas the cemetery board has reviewed the town's letter and materials and the proposal pursuant to Article 15 of the Not-for-Profit Corporation Law, Article 8 of the Environmental Law, otherwise known as the State Environmental Quality Review Act, or SEQR, and implementing regulations. And whereas on April 18, 2023, the cemetery board previously reviewed the cemetery's application to lease land and construct an office park related to the proposal and issued a resolution in response. And whereas on August 29, 2023, the cemetery board through council transmitted to the town the cemetery's application to construct an office park and lease land, and the recording of the cemetery board's April 18, 2023 meeting, including public comments the cemetery board received. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the cemetery board does not object to the town's status as lead agency. The cemetery board shall act as an involved agency. The cemetery board's jurisdiction is to review and make a determination on the cemetery's application to lease land and construct an office park consistent with SEQR, Article 15 of the NPCL, implementing regulations, and more specifically, NPCL Section 1506-E and 19 NYC-RR Section 201.16. Despite Bristol Suffolk LLC's omission of the cemetery board from the, quote, permit and approvals required, end quote, listed in Part 1 of the EAF, the cemetery board's approval of the cemetery's application to lease land and construct an office park is required. The cemetery board recommends that to ensure compliance with NPCL 1506-A, A1, the draft municipal zoning code should prohibit funeral homes, either through an amendment to Section 213-573A5, quote, offices but not including medical offices or funeral homes, end quote, or a new Section 213-573C6, funeral homes. The draft municipal code Section 213-578C permits underground parking, which may negatively impact the ability to use the land for cemetery purposes in the future, as NPCL Section 1510M prohibits the use of construction or demolition debris for burial and may increase the cost of removing structures at the end of the lease as contemplated by NPCL Section 1506-E. The proposal may negatively impact adjacent cemetery operations through stormwater runoff. Part 1 of the EAF expresses a plan to develop a recharge basin at the eastern edge of the office park, and the cemetery board desires to ensure that stormwater runoff and any stormwater management structures not negatively impact the grounds and monuments of adjacent cemetery operations. The draft municipal code, section 213-574, permits buildings to a height of 50 feet, and part 1 of the EAF contemplates buildings as high as 46 feet. The cemetery board lacks information as to whether these heights will visually impact cemetery operations and whether they differ from the cemetery's prior plans that buildings would be single-story and would not be visible from existing cemetery operations. The siting of the proposal may negatively impact adjacent cemetery operations in Lot 2 through noise and visual impacts. The draft municipal code, section 213-575, sets forth yard depths with setbacks as little as 65 feet, with greater depths adjacent to residential uses. Part 1 of the EAF, expanded project narrative, suggests noise walls are proposed to abate noise at adjacent residential uses and installation of double or triple rows of evergreen trees adjacent to residential uses and the Lot 2 cemetery. Prior representations from the cemetery have indicated buffers of at least 100 feet between the proposed buildings and the adjacent Lot 2 cemetery. It is unclear whether the enhanced setbacks and noise walls proposed for adjacent residential uses apply to adjacent cemetery uses. And, as further information becomes available, the cemetery board may have additional observations or concerns, including but not limited to traffic impacts and the potential for generation, treatment, storage, or disposal of hazardous waste.
I'll make a motion to make a motion to make the motion is read. And if I get a second, then we're gonna have the last discussion. So do we have a second?
I'll second.
All right, so the motion is on the table. Do board members have issues they'd like to address, corrections, additions to the proposed resolution?
No.
Okay, I have none. Okay, that being said, then all in favor of the resolution is read? Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion is approved. Thank you, Rob. So part 1. On to part 2.
So this one's gonna be a little shorter. Just to clarify something Rob said earlier, this one's not actually from the town, this is from the planning board of Wayanda, which is a town in Orange County. There is a group of people that are looking to start a new cemetery in Wayanda. It surrounds an existing, largely inactive regulated cemetery, or not very active, I should say, a regulated cemetery on 3 sides, or would surround an existing not very active regulated cemetery on 3 sides. We had correspondence from the engineer representing the promoters of the cemetery back in August, asking us for clarification that we don't regulate private for-profit cemeteries. The clarification I gave him is, ain't no such thing as for-profit cemeteries, and this cemetery would be too large to constitute a private cemetery, even if it could somehow meet the definition of private cemetery. Subsequent to that email, we have never had any application from the cemetery for approval of its incorporation as a not-for-profit cemetery pursuant to section 1505 of the not-for-profit corporation law. But they did go out and incorporate a domestic not-for-profit, not cemetery corporation in September. I can only guess, because I haven't heard directly from any of these guys, that was in response to my email. The next thing we heard on this project was something earlier. We got it in early March. It was dated February 28th. That the planning board was. Oh, by the way, I did forward that email I described to you both to the town's attorney and the planning board's attorney. The next thing we got was a notice from them, essentially like the one we got from the town of Babylon, saying, "Hey, we're going to serve as lead agency on this project. We plan to serve as lead agency on this project." I believe they described it as an unlisted action rather than as a type 1 action. I don't know, Rob, maybe you know, maybe it doesn't matter whether that binds them to following either a type 1 or unlisted, but they're proposing coordinated review and proposing to be lead agency. In terms of the environmental impacts, it seems to us to be entirely appropriate for the locals to be the lead agency on planning such a thing. In essence, I also personally visited the site week before last, I think. So when I say I visited the site, I visited the regulated cemetery and drove around the parcel where the other cemetery would be. I did not trespass. I just looked at it from the outside. So with that said, there were a couple, so that fundamentally, we think it makes sense for the locals to be lead agency. If this, as it is structured right now, this project obviously should be a regulated cemetery, and based on what we know, which is very little. It should be a regulated cemetery, and the promoters should be coming to, or incorporators, or whoever, should be coming to us with the documents required under section 1505, and what we typically ask for any such application, which is essentially a business plan to demonstrate that the cemetery will be operated on a not-for-profit basis and not become a burden on the community. We don't want any new cemeteries popping up where people are lining their pockets. We also don't want any new cemeteries popping up. This is probably more often a concern, that the cemetery is just going to fail and impose a burden on the town when the town has to maintain it. That said, we can't comment on an application we haven't seen, but we think that from what it seems as the structure is right now, they need to come to us for that. We do have some, what you might call more traditional environmental concerns. I spelled them out in my memo. They're also in the draft resolution that we want to flag for the town. There's the biggest ones are at one side of the regulated cemetery to its sort of northeast side and southeast side. It kind of slopes down towards where the proposed cemetery is going to be. So we want to make sure that whatever they're doing over there doesn't somehow undermine the regulated cemetery up on the slightly higher ground. There's a bit of a drop off in some of these areas. So one could imagine, depending on what you're doing to grade, it could have an impact. Conversely, and on the very other side of the regulated cemetery, there's a big hill. That little piece slopes up, the slope continues outside the regulated cemetery's property. And we want to make sure that whatever they're doing on the top of that hill doesn't cause debris, runoff, or what have you to come down into the regulated cemetery. It's also unclear to us whether they put the regulated cemetery on notice. That might be hard to do because the regulated cemetery's contact with us was actually not up to date. I do have updated contact for them, but hopefully we believe they should be put on notice, and if the planning board needs, they're welcome to contact me, and I do have a contact for a board member there now. I should say that board member, I've heard indirectly, I have not spoken to him yet, is aware of the proposal. But it would be that this is out there, but I don't know that he's gotten a formal notice that this is going on. I kind of think they should. Then the last thing I'll notice, they're talking about putting a well in, I assume for some kind of either for irrigation or for their office. The state sanitary code does have required distances between burials and wells. So that would be an issue. Again, I think we don't even know exactly what they're doing, but just flagging that there are required setbacks for wells in the state sanitary code. And we do mention that in the draft resolution. I guess I'll stop there and ask if there's any big picture questions. And Rob, one of us could read the resolution and see if there's anybody else out there. This one's a slightly shorter resolution.
Yep. But let me just stop there and see if anybody has any questions of the division or whatever of what we're doing to become clear. We're recorded, is that right?
It should be.
Yeah, and is there a way to put where do we put resolutions? Can they be put in the chat, or are they normally up on the web?
They're already on the
They are
website.
on the
Okay,
website.
great. So our resolutions will be available to the
Yeah, the
public.
draft resolutions were posted with the materials for this meeting. We can post the final resolutions afterwards.
Again, these public actions, I just want to make sure that
Yeah, specifically this resolution is in the document titled Wyanda Notice of Intent to Serve as Lead Agency under
The first
under Exhibit A.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. We'll find out. Is there anyone, no questions for board members, is there anyone from the public that wishes to address this issue before the board that's online?
Hi, I'm Denise Quinn. I'm the town supervisor from Way Wyanda.
Excuse me, I'm having a little trouble hearing you. Can you speak more directly into your microphone? Identify yourself, please.
Yeah, apologies, there's sort of a lot of background noise from our ventilation. We're gonna try to see if we can make it louder here. Is there a volume control on that thing?
How about now?
That's
That's
better,
better.
thank you.
That's good.
Okay. So I'm Denise Quinn. I'm the town supervisor from the town of Way Wyanda. And my question is, the existing cemetery, is there a way that the new cemetery would be able to take over that cemetery if the current administration of the existing cemetery was open to that?
It would be, hi, Louis Polishuk, Director of the Division of Cemeteries. I think the short answer is there are different ways for regulated cemeteries to assume responsibility, either via merger, or if a cemetery is abandoned for another regulated cemetery. There's also a provision that allows them to enter into a management agreement where the one operates the other. But that can only happen between regulated cemeteries, and as far as I can tell, the people behind this cemetery have done everything but seek to become a regulated cemetery.
Which they have to.
Which as far as we can tell.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So, a regulated cemetery, there are several ways a regulated cemetery can assume responsibility for another one. Merger or consolidation, if the one of the regulated cemeteries becomes abandoned, or via a management agreement. Those all presuppose that both cemeteries are regulated cemeteries. The group behind this new proposed cemetery has not sought approval of a regulated cemetery and has in fact indicated that they're trying to come up with ways by which they would not be regulated.
And why would they do that?
You'd have to ask them, they haven't spoken to me.
But
Well, is it because of the number of plots that they're looking to have? Like, do regulated cemetery, no?
If you are offering graves to the, again, this is broadly speaking and subject to the lawyers saying lawyer stuff and getting this precisely correct. If you are offering graves to the general public and you're not a religious corporation, a municipality, or the federal government or state government, you must be a regulated cemetery.
Okay.
so it's not really an option based on what we know of cemeteries being proposed.
Right. The only relevance for size is there's a size limit on private cemeteries, but our understanding is, by definition, private cemeteries are private and not selling graves to the public.
So they will need to become a regulated, a not-for-profit based on our statute and regulations.
I mean, there's, again, not having seen an application, I couldn't tell you how we'd act, but there's no reason they couldn't apply.
To become a regulated cemetery.
Correct.
I don't know, Denise, have we answered your question?
Yes, you have, thank you.
Okay, thank you for commenting. Is there anyone else that wants to address the board that's online? Is there anyone else here that would like to address the board? There being none?
Can I
go ahead
just
and
ask?
read-
Can I just ask a
Go ahead.
question, just so I'm understanding? And I guess the representative from the town might be able to answer. So the town is seeking to be the lead agency, but it isn't clear that this entity is without getting approval to be a regulated cemetery, going to be able to engage in the business of running a cemetery that the town is contemplating being the lead agency on the development of. Is that it?
Are
It's
the
planning-
engineers on? I'm
Sorry,
gonna
go
let
ahead.
him answer that.
So I can speak to that. Pat Hines, representing the town engineer's office. We brought up this issue in our initial comments when we received the application, that exactly what was just stated, what are cemeteries in New York. And it looks like they half-heartedly applied to become a not-for-profit. And it wasn't until we just received information from the cemetery board here that they didn't do that successfully. So we will be commenting at the planning board that they need to become a regulated cemetery through your board. But this is our first episode through this, and we're on a learning curve ourselves, but it
Okay.
seems like they are as well.
Okay.
Jill, just one more clarification.
No, that's
It's-
helpful. I just wanted to know if there's any more information that we didn't have.
Sorry, Jill, there's one more clarification. Formally speaking, it's the planning board, not the town, that seeks to be lead
You
agency
said
on
that.
this one.
Okay.
It's different from
Okay.
Babylon, where it's the town itself. And again, if anybody.
It's the town's
from
planning
munis-
board though, right?
Yes.
Correct.
If anybody from the municipality has contact for an attorney for this agency, for the people behind the cemetery, we'd love to have that, because part of the issue might have been the guy I reached out to was an engineer, not a lawyer.
Yeah, I can
Okay.
review our files and see if we have that, but we do have contact with that engineer, and we can forward your concerns to them via our
Great.
planning board process.
Thank you.
All right. So, Rob, would you read the resolution, please?
Of course.
You want me to do it? Here you
No,
go.
I like the,
You know what? I'll put my mask back on.
I like the radio voice.
All right. Whereas on February 28th, 2024, the Town Planning Board of Waiwayanda, the planning board, issued materials, the notice, to several involved agencies, including the New York State Department of State Division of Cemeteries. And whereas the notice pertains to a proposal for Fooling Cemetery, the cemetery, described as a 7.83 acre non-denominational cemetery, construction of a well, subsurface sanitary sewer disposal system, stormwater management facility, and fencing. And whereas the planning board has sought lead agency status, and whereas the cemetery board has reviewed the notice pursuant to Article 15 of the Not-for-Profit Corporation Law, Article 8 of the Environmental Law, otherwise known as the State Environmental Quality Review Act, or SEQR, and implementing regulations. Now therefore be it resolved that the cemetery board does not object to the planning board status as lead agency. The cemetery board shall act as an involved agency. The cemetery board's jurisdiction is to review and make a determination regarding a cemetery's application to incorporate as a cemetery corporation pursuant to NPCL sections 1505 and 404E, and undertake major renovations pursuant to 19 NYCRR section 201.16. To date, the cemetery board has not received such an application from the cemetery. Despite the cemetery's assertion in Part 1 of the Environmental Assessment Form, EAF, to operate the cemetery as described requires the approval of the cemetery board. The proposed cemetery may negatively impact an adjacent cemetery's grounds and monuments, Union Cemetery Association number 36-035, through grading, filling, and stormwater management practices. The cemetery may cause additional intermittent traffic impacts, and the cemetery's proposal for a water well may be prohibited or restricted in location by 10 NYCRR subpart 5-1.
Rob, I have a question. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, it's on the table for discussion, or I'll put it on the
Okay.
table. I'll make that motion, have a second, then we'll discuss it. But second, all right, so yes.
Okay, the question is, if this is not a regulated cemetery at this point, do we only have the jurisdiction that you just referenced when and if they become a regulated cemetery?
And so in relation to the major renovation application?
Mhm.
Right, so I was trying to think about this. So let's propose that, if myself and a couple of nice people, and I didn't have the public officers law prohibitions on running private, not-for-profit cemeteries myself, let's say a group of people owned land and they just said, so we want to own land and we want to build a stormwater management facility on it and a fence around it. Would
Right.
that go to the cemetery board? I don't think so because they're not a cemetery. So theoretically,
That was my point. That was what I was
Sure.
wondering. Yeah.
yeah, and I thought about sort of drafting it that way, and then I thought, well, I'm hoping that the individuals that are looking to run a non-denominational cemetery, who reached out previously for guidance, who were told that is way too big, let alone selling to the public, you can't fall under Article 14. I'm hoping that they will now hear this and say, well, my goodness, we need to perhaps amend our proposed certificate of incorporation and send it to the cemetery board and fill out an application for a major renovation and, do what they need to do. So
Because
I
at the
think
end
you're
of the
right.
day,
Go ahead.
at the end of the day, if they don't, and I mean, again, we're in the land of a lot of supposition here, but if they are this group of individuals who is not a regulated cemetery, but is running a cemetery, they're not going to be able to continue doing that without becoming a regulated cemetery. So we're really only talking about this application now. At the end of the day, whether or not we have jurisdiction in connection with this application, ultimately the running of a cemetery without being a regulated cemetery is within our jurisdiction. So that analysis is correct, right?
Well, the only thing I might add is I'm not sure who the "our" was in your last sentence. "Our" might be you rather than us.
The board, correct.
No.
Oh,
The AG
right,
rather than the board.
That's right.
If I don't know the answer to this, I guess Rob would have to do some homework, but if somebody just goes rogue and runs what looks like a regulated cemetery without coming to us, I don't know whether we go after them in the first instance or you as AG go after them in the first instance. Hopefully it won't come to that.
Attorney General is always,
let's just hope that
always
there's an
there willing to
application.
represent the agencies.
Again, the goal is, if this is a good project, the goal is to support the application of
Absolutely.
a regulated cemetery that looks like it's going to be a net benefit for the community.
Absolutely.
Okay, so motion's on the table. Any further discussion on this resolution as read? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Resolution is approved. I think that completes our business today. We've had public comment on both. I'll take a quick moment. Anybody have any other issues they'd like to raise to the board other than the two we've already discussed? Tearing the fabric of the universe. That's an inside joke, but anyway. Okay, so the next board meeting is scheduled for April 9th at Washington Avenue, 11th floor of the conference room, and I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I'll second that.
Okay, motion is on the table. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you all very much.